Welcome to the Women Leading Worldwide podcast, a collaborative effort between Team Women and Global Minnesota, two Minnesota-based nonprofits with a global reach and shared focus of advancing leadership development opportunities, engagement, and access. I'm Katie Burke, Executive Director and Board Member of Team Women and your host. I'm truly honored to introduce our speaker, Paula Caballero, who's the Managing Director of the Lands for Life program at RARE. She has a long history in the field of development, including as Senior Director at the World Bank, where she established the Environment and Natural Resources Global Practice. Previously, while serving as Director for Economic, Social, and Environmental Affairs in the Colombian Ministry of Foreign Affairs, she spearheaded the creation and negotiation of the Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs. For her work as lead proponent of the SDGs, she was awarded the German Sustainability Award in 2019 and the Zayed International Prize for the Environment in 2014 for her contribution to environment action leading to positive change. Thank you so much, Paula. It's wonderful to have you here today and to share your story.
Thank you very much, Katie, for inviting me. I want to really express my appreciation to Team Women and Global Minnesota for your leadership and for the fact that you really bring the world to the local and vice versa. So it's a pleasure to be with you today.
Would you share just a little bit of background on yourself, including how you got engaged in sustainability and global issues?
I have been working on global and regional sustainable development issues for over 2 decades. I've worked with governments, with NGO, with the World Bank, with the UN. At the UN, I developed a large portfolio of projects on land degradation and biodiversity, fisheries, management of international waters. And most of these projects were throughout South America and the Caribbean, but I was also managing a global program with almost 50 of the world's least developed countries. And this was really exciting work. I loved working at the UN development program, UNDP. But in 2010, the Colombian government came under a new administration of President Santos. And I was asked to become the director, as you pointed out, of Economic, Environmental, and Social Affairs at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. I used to joke that it would have been easier to call me the Director for Sustainable Development because my teams covered such a huge range of issues around these 3 dimensions. But that's why I left the UN. I left the UN to go work with my government because I really felt called to help and to contribute to the vision that President Santos had for a country that was coming out of 50 years of civil war. And I wanted to be a part of that and give back.
Well, thank you for sharing your background, Paula. The idea of the SDGs at the time was revolutionary. Can you just tell us why?
Certainly, and I think it's a good question. I have to go back a little bit to the beginning of the millennium in the year 2000, so that we can understand what it was that why the SDGs were in fact revolutionary. In 2001, the world, and I mean all governments of the world, adopted something called the Millennium Development Goals. And these were 8 goals that were focused on really important issues like eradicating hunger and poverty and focusing on communicable diseases like HIV, AIDS, and malaria. And so these were really important issues. And, it was really good that you had a metric, targets, because what you measure matters and vice versa, But the problem was that the MDGs, even though they were focused on these key issues, were still very narrow because there was only a focus on social issues, and that very narrow. So they focused, for example, on ending hunger, but not on how you transform the food system so you can really end hunger for once and for all, or eradicate it or diminish it and put in place long-term solutions. In other words, you need to embrace the complexity. And you cannot deliver, for example, on health just by tackling some communicable diseases, because you also have to look at the non-communicable diseases. Even in a time of COVID, that is important. You need to look at how the health system is functioning, and is there energy, and is there transport, and what are cities like, and how are we dealing with the environment? The MDGs were great, and they were a really good first step, but they were too narrow. So we needed something that built on the MDGs, but went way beyond them. So that's the first reason why the SDGs were revolutionary, because they broke with that narrow paradigm and said, wait, we need to look at the whole of development. The second issue, which was one of the reasons why there was so much opposition to the SDGs, is that at the time when the MDGs were created, the world was really divided into two camps. There were developed countries and developing countries. And only developing countries had a problem with development. Apparently, developed countries had it all sorted out. There was no problems whatsoever. And their only responsibility in this vision of the world was to provide some funding for developing countries to deliver on and improve their standing across a range of development issues. And this is, quite frankly, a very limited way of looking at the world because, well, developed countries do have development problems. We're seeing that around the world. There's issues with, giving access to education and maternal mortality also in countries. There's deep pockets of inequality and poverty in many developed countries. So that means that there's shared issues. All countries share issues, some more than others, but there are shared issues. The other is that we have to tackle issues around global commons. Climate change is really critical. Fisheries and biodiversity and global trade. We live in a completely globalized world. So wait, that means that we need a universal agenda, not a world that's divided into us and them, developed and developing. And this idea of a universal agenda was considered really at the moment when it was proposed, absolutely impossible and ridiculous, because it shifted how we understood and how people were used to thinking about development. So you said to somebody, tell me about development problems. They were thinking about the problems in, Botswana or Bhutan. They were not thinking about the problems in Belgium or in Germany. And so that was a very big issue. And then the third issue was that we're used to sectors. Our governments are organized around sectors. The UN is organized around sectors. The World Bank, everything's organized around sectors. And we felt very strongly that we needed an integrated agenda. So you could really understand how, if you invest or have a policy in one sector, wait, is it good for all other sectors, or are there trade-offs? Are there what we generate what we call externalities, that sort of bad things that come out of good things that you do elsewhere? And also, where are the win-wins? Are we really, maybe a policy is written with a very narrow focus, and if you broaden it, you can actually do good, not just for one sector of one region, for other sectors or for other issue areas. So you need an integration. We can't keep looking at it just in these tiny little silos. Also, because a lot of these huge issues that we have to deal with, like climate change, require that we look across the whole of the board. And things like, heat waves or cold waves that we've seen, storms, COVID, all of that talks to the fact that these are really complicated issues and we have to look at them. We need a way, a lens, like a pair of glasses that we can put on that help us to decipher that complexity and say, okay, these are the entry points. This is where we can start to do something. And that was the third reason why the SDGs were so revolutionary, because it went against the grain of the siloed and the sectors. And for some, instead of seeing it as integration, it was like, wait, so you're asking for like a dog's breakfast, which of course wasn't it. But if you want to deride and to characterize how things are seen, that was a third reason for the opposition. So what are the SDGs? At the end of the day, what the world agreed to in 2015 is this remarkable framework that has 17 goals, and there's targets under those goals. And the goals are around some of the main development issues, like, for example, sustainable food systems, right? Agriculture. So it goes beyond ending hunger to really creating food systems that work. It deals with things like competitiveness and infrastructure. They deal with things like energy. They deal with things like agriculture and the nexus to biodiversity, to what you can call like life above land and life underwater, i.e. fisheries and marine issues. It deals with a hugely important arena around urban issues in cities. Cities can be huge drivers of innovation and of equality and of opportunity, but you need to harness that. So the SDGs are 17 goals that cut across some of these or identify some of these main areas. But what's really important about the SDGs is that they're not meant to be implemented in silos. they really are about that integration. And under each one of these 17 goals that were, as I say, negotiated really with the world's leading expertise, there's targets. And I'm going to give a number and people are going to go, oh my God, this is too much. But if you think about how complex it is, all the things we have to challenge, I tell you, it really is not very much. So the 17 SDGs are accompanied by 169 targets that are very focused on very key issues. For example, ending food waste. And food waste is something that will look very different in a place like Colombia, where probably a lot of the food that's wasted is in the harvest, moment of harvest. And it will look different in places like the US, where the food waste will be where we consume and we throw out a lot of the food that we buy. So there's different entry points, but these targets are hugely relevant and can be adapted to the reality of every country. And the SDGs have become revolutionary because now not just governments have embraced them, but private sector finally found something coming out of the UN that made sense to them and that they could latch onto. And that had already happened with the MDGs, but with the SDGs, we're seeing private sector embrace it so vibrantly. Academia, it's just an agenda that everybody can own. So the SDGs were revolutionary, but now I hope you understand a little bit more of just why they were so revolutionary.
Oh, it's amazing. Every time I hear you talk about this, it just makes me realize how these became like the world's strategic plan that everybody bought into. The 193 countries bought into the strategic plan and are all operating under these goals. So now we all can think globally, but act locally. And a couple of the goals that really resonate with Team Women in our audience are the 5th SDG, gender equality, the 4th, quality education, 3rd, good health and well-being. There's so many that really impact all of us. And it just makes sense to have it be centralized. Revolutions are so difficult and usually there's so much opposition. How hard was it to get this to happen?
That's a really good question. It was an uphill battle. It was the hardest battle of my life. But if maybe I can backtrack a little bit and contextualize where it was that this revolution happened, because I'm going to describe like the battles we waged. Well, where was the battleground? So the battleground, it was something called Rio +20. Now, I think everybody remembers in 1992, there was this big Earth Summit, right? Where a lot of conventions like on biodiversity were approved. It was a big deal. And this was Rio +20. What is going to happen 20 years after the Earth Summit? And the UN and all the governments of the world had geared up to have this big happening in Rio in 2012, 20 years after the big Earth Summit. And at that point, late 2010, 2011, I had just joined government, as I mentioned, and I started to look and ask what's going to happen in Rio +20. And quite frankly, I won't go into it, but it was very, very procedural and things that wouldn't get anybody excited about anything. And so I said, wait, this is a huge opportunity. We have so many global problems in the world right now. There are so many countries and communities and different sectors that are suffering, that are dealing with degradation and inequality. This is the opportunity if we're going to have all the heads of state and presidents coming together for this massive conference. We've got to have an agenda that is as ambitious as that opportunity. And, if we're going to change the world, what do we need? So that's where I came up with this idea of the SDGs, so that the Rio +20 summit would adopt them. There were two big outcomes in Rio. One was the SDGs, and the other was the process to develop the SDGs. And let me drill a little bit into both. So I've explained to you just now why the SDGs were so different from the MDGs. Well, guess what? That stepped on a lot of toes. A lot of people were not happy. So the opposition, at the beginning, I was sort of laughed out of the rooms. There was a lot of derision because it was like, oh, come on, are you serious? You're this dog's breakfast thing. But then as it started to gain traction, the opposition became much firmer. And this happened all the way down to Rio. I mean, when we were already in June 2012 in Rio, sometimes I think we should make a movie because there were like these last minute cliffhangers where the SDGs almost got derailed because the opposition was so adamant, so vehement, and coming from such high level. But suffice it to say that part of the reason for this opposition was precisely, as you remember, the Millennium Development Goals. They had started 10 years before, and it was a great idea. The MDGs were wonderful because they also had targets and it was a metric. So what had happened was that the agenda of the development community, i.e. all of the organizations around the world that work on development, like USAID or the equivalent in all the developed countries, were structured by then around the MDGs. Everybody had the MDGs tacked on the wall. And developing countries had also organized a lot of their requests for official development assistance, et cetera, around the MDGs. And these were really key issues, maternal mortality, infant malnutrition. I mean, nobody would argue that these were not like the core development issues. So to derail or to think about broadening the agenda was absolutely, it was anathema. It was really breaking with the established religion of the MDGs, if I can put it that way. And the other was that the MDGs at that point were unfinished business because the MDGs had an end date of 2015. So to propose something to replace the MDGs when they hadn't finished also raised a lot of hackles, because it was like, wait, we have this great agenda. We've all signed on to it. The development assistance is organized around it. And you're coming right now to take that away and put in place this really bizarre idea that doesn't make any sense. So there was a lot of opposition from developed countries. One, because it changed how they had structured their thinking about development. And two, because for them, it was like, why would we have an agenda that's universal? We don't have development issues. What are we? So this is a problem for developed, not for us. And then developing countries were really afraid that they were going to, one, lose all this aid that had already been lined up for the MDGs, and that what this crazy Colombians were proposing was going to create conditionalities, things that they had to deliver on without any funding, and it was just going to be an uphill battle for them. So the agreement on this was, I cannot begin to tell you how difficult, and it took a lot of effort to get people to understand that this was a way of delivering on the MDGs. That if we really wanted to deliver on poverty eradication, on hunger, on those core health issues, we had to look at it from a broader perspective. We had to educate women, for example, as you were mentioning, Katie. And we had to deal with having energy access for everybody. And we had to deal with consumption patterns that, where the consumption and lifestyles of some of the wealthiest people around the world, not just in developed countries, the elites in developing countries also, all of those lifestyles have to change because we use up too many of the resources and there's too few. So it's a universal global agenda, and it took a lot of effort. And afterwards I had, as the process evolved years later, I had developed countries, colleagues coming to me and saying, this has been a revolution in my government because we'd never had to think about this. And when we started to actually have to drill in and think about how we deliver, we discovered that we do have so many problems. And there are pockets of inequality and poverty. And it has been a revolution in our government to figure out how to deliver on the SDGs. So that's why it was so hard to get that agreement on the SDGs. But mind you, we're talking about a revolution here. So the UN has very established processes, and it's not used to dealing on and delivering on these really complicated processes. The MDGs were basically cooked up in a UN office with no participation and no consultations. And the SDGs couldn't be like that because we needed to get everybody behind them. And if you cook that up in an office, it ain't gonna happen, right? So we were just as obsessed with how do we make this idea of the SDGs a reality in the most vibrant and ambitious way possible. And for that, we had to put in place a revolutionary process to develop the SDGs. Because if we had left the SDGs to a traditional political process, well, guess what? We would have ended up with a political outcome. That means that we would have had a very nice declaration with a lot of call outs around really heavily negotiated language, but nothing that looks and feels and smells like a metric, that can get a philanthropist or can get an entrepreneur or can get a local mayor excited about delivering on these targets. We needed that kind of a compelling metric, and a political process was not going to deliver it. We would have ended up with a dead end, not the SDGs. Or we would have ended up with what I used to call MDG plus, revamping the MDGs a little bit, being a little bit more ambitious about just how much you could eradicate poverty or infant malnutrition, but not the systems approach that we needed. So and this was the bigger battle even, it was more bitter, it was more emotional than getting agreement on the SDGs, was to create this process, a robust, evidence-based, expert-driven process. And that's what we created. And we created something that became called the Open Working Group. It was open because it was, what we propose is that it's open, webcast, everybody can see it. It's not behind closed doors. Everybody can see it and can participate, but it is not driven by the political blocs that normally negotiate in the UN. But what does that mean, Katie? It means that these blocs, right, these groups that are used to leading on the negotiations had to essentially commit harakiri, because they had to give up their negotiating role in order to make way for this completely different process. Let me explain. For example, the European Union negotiates as a bloc. So the 27 countries agree on positions, and then they delegate negotiators who go and negotiate on their behalf. And on the part of developing countries, it's even more complicated because the group is called the G Group of 77 in China. It's 134 countries. It has everything from China, South Africa, and Brazil to very small states like Tajikistan or Fiji or St. Lucia or St. Kitts. So they all have to come to agreement, and then their negotiators go and negotiate. So obviously, when you have that in a room, it's a political process. And what I was asking was for these groups to agree that the process would be led by individual countries and a small subset of them, and by experts and not by them. It meant getting all of these also diplomatic processes to give up what they're good at and open the way for something that they couldn't control from a political agenda. And that was a revolution. And so giving up that control, it was very, very bitter. It was very, as I say, emotional, but we did it. We created a revolutionary format called the Open Working Group. Eventually, it started in 2013, and the two co-chairs were the ambassadors of Hungary and Kenya. And a shout out to them because they did a brilliant job of leading it, but they wouldn't have been able to do that brilliant job if we hadn't gotten agreement on the format of the Open Working Group. So in Rio Plus 20, we actually agreed to two revolutions, the SDGs and the science-driven, evidence-based, very technical process. And that's why we have the SDGs that look and smell like a metric.
Wow. I mean, you're amazing, and your leadership and your determination and your forward thinking, what example you've shown us, all of us that are listening to you, is inspiring. And so I'm just hearing this endless negotiation for this SDGs to be accepted and adopted. How did you maintain your belief and confidence when so many were against you, including the US initially? Against the concept, I should say, right?
Right. Well, on the US, I have to say that initially there was, well, the US was very committed, many people, USID, et cetera, to the MDGs. And they also were questioning, like so many other developed countries, well, why would we be looking at development issues? But I don't have time, unfortunately, to go into so much detail in this podcast, but I can tell you that the US played the most decisive role in the last hours and days of negotiation at the Rio Plus 20. And the SDGs are in large measure also an outcome that owes so much to US leadership and to US vision and to US courage. So that for sure, I would say. But you asked me how I would maintain my confidence and, in the face of this. And let me just say that what I was seeing when I started to look at what are we going to do in Rio Plus 20 is that our growth model is so clearly on a pathway that is progressively undermining the very foundations on which progress for the last centuries has been built. Our soils and water are degraded. We've triggered the sixth mass extinction. Entire segments of population in both developed and developing countries feel disenfranchised and that they're going to be worse off than their parents. And there's a rise in populism and these virulent strains of nationalism. And then we have climate change, which is going to undermine the development gains, not of the past century, of decades, of the past centuries, and make it impossible to deliver continued well-being to people around the world in the decades to come. let me say very clearly, the SDGs and climate change are one and the same agenda. So in the face of this, I really felt that the SDGs were critical. Now, there's many core root causes for the problems that we're facing, but a key factor, as I said at the beginning, is to enable us, we need to understand all of these different issues and sectors and have a comprehensive understanding of the whole, what you can call a systems perspective, an understanding of the synergies and the trade-offs and the win-wins between and across sectors. A systems perspective so that we can put in place solutions and responses that are up to the magnitude of the transformations and the innovations that are needed. And we need for all countries to come together to that. It's not one or a few countries or only government. We need everybody, all hands on deck, and we need to get communities engaged and private sector and academia have to come together and work together. And you can't do that unless you have a shared understanding, a shared vision, a shared metric, something that can be this galvanizing reference, this lighthouse around which, even if you choose to ignore it, it's there. And then you can go on your merry way with business as usual. But you have to willfully and willingly ignore that vision of integration that the SDGs are there. They're like a beacon of what needs to happen. And I was obsessed with the need to create that beacon, that idea of a shared systemic framework. So throughout the years of these very bitter and difficult battles, and it was years because I came up with the idea at the end of 2010, 2015, and the negotiation of the SDGs really ended in July of 2014. So it was years of really hard battles. We never gave up hope. And I say we because I was profoundly fortunate to work in a government of incredibly enlightened people who immediately understood what I was proposing and supported the process. If they hadn't understood that, if they had been part of everybody who thought that was ridiculous, it's already been done, why are you reinventing the MDGs? This is dog's breakfast. Anybody who had that vision, but no, the minute I took it to my vice minister, my boss, who's Patti Londoño at that time, she said, the SDGs are your priority. This is it. And then we sold the idea. We didn't even have to sell. We took the idea to the minister and to the president. And the president declared it that this was a priority for the government. I had the entire government behind me every time I went into those negotiations. And I would say that this isn't just whole of government undertaking. It became a whole of society. I led working groups with 17 ministries and agencies coming together, trying on for size within Colombia. Okay, if this is such a great idea, what does it feel like to actually try to implement it in government? And everybody played along. It was remarkable. And from the beginning, and this I'm very, very proud of, we actively engaged civil society and private sector. This was not a government undertaking. And that drive that came from Colombia to make sure that it was a completely inclusive process was taken up by UNDP, was taken up by so many others, eventually by the Open Working Group. And that's why the SDGs are so vibrant and resonate so much. Everybody had a part in playing and in delivering on them.
So true. And I mean, I know that the SDGs are so relevant for business, and we have so many corporations within the Twin Cities area that are using them and using them as beacons, as you say, beacons and guiding forces. And so it's helpful. It's again, just that overview of how we can think globally and act locally. So thank you for that. I know we're running short on time, Paula, but I do just want to ask a final question. How can listeners connect with you now?
Thank you very much. Well, as I keep saying, this is quite a journey and quite a story. So I'm writing a book about it together with my vice minister, with Patti. And we hope that the book will come out maybe towards the end of the year. We're actually looking for a publisher right now. And if listeners are interested in this amazing story, which was led by Colombia, but had so many participants from around the world. So it's really, I cannot give credit here to how many people made this a reality, including, as I say, from the US. And the book will do more justice to the richness of the process, the complexity, and all of the pitfalls and amazing moments that made it up. So I look forward to sharing that book with the world when it comes out. And there's actually, I wrote a short article, that the book is now expanding on that, but there's a short article called A Short History of the SDGs, and that's online. If you Google it, you can find it. And it goes into a little bit more detail of what I've said today. Thank you so much for
Thank you
inviting me.
so much for being here, Paula. I just really appreciated, first of all, I appreciate your leadership in this effort, in this global effort. I appreciate you taking time out of your crazy busy schedule to share your story with us. And of course, I appreciate our partnership with Global Minnesota, who connected us. So, and I know our audience will really be enlightened and inspired by hearing your story. So
thank you for having me, and thank you for making me a part of your very exciting and innovative processes.